The forest outside the village loomed, dark and impenetrable, as if it were holding its breath. I grew up hearing whispers about the Strzyga, a cursed spirit that haunted those woods. They said it had once been a partisan during the war, betrayed by his comrades and left to die at the hands of the enemy. The betrayal had twisted him in death, transforming him into something neither fully alive nor entirely dead. Everyone in the village knew about the Strzyga. The old women swore they'd seen its pale form gliding through the trees, while the younger folk dismissed the stories as superstitions. Still, no one ventured into the forest after sunset. Not even the bravest hunters dared challenge the curse. For me, the stories were more than just old wives' tales. They were a challenge. I was 16, caught between disbelief and the lingering awe instilled by my elders. To me, the forest wasn't a place of danger. It was an adventure waiting to happen. "You're really going into the forest?" Mark asked, his wide eyes betraying a mix of fear and admiration. We were sitting on the low stone wall near the edge of the village, where the shadow of the forest stretched toward us as the sun dipped lower. I grinned, feigning a confidence I wasn't entirely sure I felt. "Only as far as the clearing," I said, shrugging. "What's the worst that could happen?" Merrick's expression darkened. "You know what my grandmother says. The Strzyga hunts anyone who enters the woods. It drinks their blood and wears their skin." "Your grandmother also says cats are witches in disguise," I retorted, though I couldn't completely ignore the unease in his voice. "Look, I'll be fine. I just want to prove that the forest is nothing but trees and shadows." He glanced toward the looming tree line. The setting sun cast long, writhing shadows that seemed almost alive. "Just be careful," he muttered. "People don't come back the same." The village bell tolled, its deep chime echoing across the fields. I hopped off the wall, feeling the cool evening air bite at my skin. Adjusting my lantern, I gave Merrick a quick nod before heading toward the forest. The tree line loomed ahead, jagged and imposing against the twilight sky. The moment I stepped onto the narrow path leading to the woods, the temperature dropped and the air grew dense. Familiar village sounds faded behind me, replaced by an eerie stillness. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees stretched tall and twisted, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers, blocking out what little light remained. My lantern cast flickering shadows that danced across the uneven ground, making my footsteps sound unnaturally loud in the silence. As I walked, strange symbols carved into the trees caught my eye. Their sharp, deliberate lines looked ancient, as though etched with purpose long ago. I stopped to examine one, running my fingers over the grooves. The bark felt unnaturally cold, almost like stone. A sudden rustling in the underbrush made me freeze. Holding the lantern high, I scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. The forest was still again, yet the silence felt heavier somehow. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. "Just the wind," I muttered, though the words sounded hollow. I pressed on, tightening my grip on the lantern's handle. The clearing was close. I'd heard about an old shrine that was once there, where villagers used to leave offerings to appease the forest spirits. If it still existed, it would prove the Strzyga was just another tale meant to keep kids like me from wandering too far. When I finally reached the clearing, I stopped in my tracks. In the center stood the remnants of the shrine, its roof caved in and its wooden frame overtaken by moss and vines. The air here felt different, heavier, as though the clearing itself was holding its breath. I approached cautiously, the lantern's light illuminating the decaying wood. Kneeling before the shrine, I noticed something partially buried in the dirt. A small journal with a cracked leather cover. Brushing off the soil, I carefully opened it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting and faded ink. The first entry sent a chill down my spine.
They left me here, my brothers, my comrades, betrayed and forgotten. I will not forgive. I will not rest.
The lantern's light flickered, and a sharp snap behind me made me whirl around. I saw nothing but shadows, yet the air felt charged with unseen tension. Stuffing the journal into my coat, I turned back toward the path. It was time to leave. But as I stepped into the trees, the whispers began. The whispers trailed me as I hurried down the path, the journal clutched tightly against my chest. Those strange carvings on the trees seemed more sinister now, their angular shapes like frozen whispers etched into the bark. Glancing over my shoulder, I noticed the path behind me had changed. It looked narrower, the trees leaning closer together, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. It was as though the forest itself had shifted, conspiring to keep me within its grasp. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on the path ahead. The whispers started faintly, threading through the silence like distant murmurs. At first, I thought it was the wind stirring the branches, but as I listened closer, the sounds grew clearer. They weren't words exactly, but their tone carried an accusatory edge, rising and falling like a chant. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The sound echoed briefly before being swallowed by the forest. No answer came, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The lantern dimmed momentarily, and the trees seemed to press closer. Panic clawed at my chest. I quickened my pace, the narrow path winding through a corridor of shadows. My heart thudded in my ears, each beat echoing louder than the last. A sudden rustle in the underbrush made me stop cold. Swinging the lantern toward the sound, I saw nothing but twisted roots and fallen leaves. The whispers swelled, mocking my fear. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, gripping the lantern tighter as I stumbled forward. The ground sloped downward, slick with damp leaves. I slipped, catching myself against a tree. Its bark felt rough and cold under my palm, and as I steadied myself, I noticed fresh carvings. These symbols were sharper, newer, their lines glowing faintly in the lantern's light. "It's just stories," I muttered to myself, though the words did little to calm my racing heart. "It's not real." But as the whispers rose to a crescendo and the forest closed in around me, I began to wonder if I was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had followed me home. Even though I had made it back to the village safely, the whispers still lingered in my mind, faint and teasing, like a melody I couldn't unhear. As I sat by the fire in our small cottage that evening, every creak of the wooden walls and crackle of the flames made me flinch. "Did something happen in the woods?" my mother asked, setting a bowl of steaming soup in front of me. Her brow furrowed as she studied my face. "No, nothing," I lied quickly. "Just got spooked by some shadows, that's all." But she didn't seem convinced, and chose not to press the issue. I wasn't ready to explain what had happened or what I thought had happened. Even I wasn't sure if it was real. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I pulled the journal from my coat and placed it on the table. Its worn leather cover looked older now, as if it had aged decades in just a few hours. With a deep breath, I opened it again. The flickering lantern light illuminated the fading writing, and I began to read. The early entries were straightforward, detailing days of camaraderie and survival.
We fought for our land, for our people. We are brothers in arms.
But halfway through, the tone shifted, the handwriting grew jagged, the sentences shorter and more frantic.
They lied to me. They left me. They left me for dead.
My stomach churned as I continued reading. The final pages were filled with scrawled words barely legible.
They will pay. All of them. I will not forgive. I will not rest.
A chill ran down my spine. The air around me felt heavy, as if something unseen was pressing against my chest. I closed the journal quickly, shoving it back into my coat. Whatever had happened in that forest wasn't just a story. Sleep didn't come easily. My dreams were a tangled mess of shadows and whispers. I saw the twisted trees closing in around me, heard the voice from the journal repeating its final hateful words. I woke several times, drenched in cold sweat, convinced that the forest was just outside my window. When morning finally came, I was relieved to see the familiar light of day creeping through the cracks in the shutters. But even then, the whispers didn't fully leave me. They hovered at the edges of my hearing, faint but persistent. I tried to go about my day as usual, but everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. It was as if the forest had left a mark on me that only I could feel. Merrick found me near the well, hauling up a bucket of water. "You look like you didn't sleep at all," he said, his voice low. "I didn't," I admitted, wiping sweat from my brow. "The whispers, they didn't stop when I got home." Merrick's expression grew serious. "My grandmother said that once the Strzyga marks someone, it doesn't let go." "I don't believe in curses," I muttered, though my voice lacked conviction. It's just, I don't know. Maybe it's all in my head." "Maybe," Merrick said, but there was doubt in his eyes. "But maybe it's not." By midday, the whispers had faded to the point where I could almost ignore them. But a nagging sense of unease remained. Something had changed. The forest wasn't done with me. Not yet. That evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods once more. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village fields. The trees stood tall and silent, their dark forms blending into the encroaching night. "What are you doing?" Merrick's voice startled me. I turned to see him approaching, his expression a mix of concern and fear. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel like it's still watching me, like it's waiting." "Then don't go back," Merrick said urgently. "You don't owe it anything. Whatever it is, let it stay in the forest." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The forest had marked me, and the whispers had followed me home. Whether I liked it or not, this wasn't over. As the last light of day disappeared behind the horizon, I turned away from the forest, determined to push the thoughts aside. But as Merrick and I walked back toward the village, a faint sound carried on the wind, just loud enough for me to hear. A whisper.
Remember.
The whispers didn't stop entirely when the dawn broke. Though softer now, they lingered at the edge of my hearing, threading through the early morning sounds of the village. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked through the square, the journal pressed tightly under my arm. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the weight pressing on my chest said otherwise. By midday, strange occurrences had spread through the village like wildfire. Livestock had gone missing overnight, their pens mysteriously left open. A farmer claimed to have seen a pale figure moving between the trees at the edge of the forest. His voice trembled as he spoke, his eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. "It's the Strzyga," Merrick whispered as we sat on the low stone wall by the church. He leaned in close, his gaze flickering back and forth between me and the woods. "You woke it up, didn't you?" "I didn't mean to," I admitted quietly. The journal in my hands felt heavier than ever. But something is definitely wrong. I can feel it. Before Merrick could respond, his grandmother shuffled past us, clutching her rosary tightly. She muttered prayers under her breath, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Several other villagers followed her lead, gathering near the church doors as if seeking protection. "They're scared," Merrick said, his voice low. "You should be too." Before I could reply, a loud crash echoed across the square, cutting through the tense air like a knife. The church bell had begun tolling wildly, its deep chimes uneven and frantic, as if something unseen had seized control of it. People froze, their faces pale with fear. "What's happening?" someone shouted. Without thinking, Merrick and I ran toward the church, weaving through the growing crowd. The bell continued its erratic tolling. My heart pounded as we reached the entrance. Inside, the church was dimly lit by flickering candles. The smell of incense hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of damp stone. The village elder stood at the altar, her frail frame somehow imposing as she raised her hands to calm the crowd. "The Strzyga has awakened," she said, her voice steady despite the fear etched into her features. "Its hunger has returned, and it will not stop until it is satisfied." A ripple of panic spread through the villagers. Some fell to their knees in prayer, while others whispered anxiously among themselves. Merrick gripped my arm tightly. "We have to do something," he hissed, "before it's too late." "What can we do?" I whispered back. The journal felt like a lead weight in my hands. "I don't even know what it wants." "You disturbed its rest," the elder said, as if reading my mind. Her piercing gaze locked onto mine. "Bring the journal to the altar, quickly." The crowd parted as I stepped forward, my legs trembling with each step. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more insistent. I placed the journal on the altar, its worn leather cover gleaming dully in the candlelight. "Open it," the elder commanded. "Show it what it seeks." With trembling hands, I flipped to the final page. The words there seemed to pulse in the dim light.
They betrayed me. They left me to die. I will not forgive. I will not rest.
The air grew colder still, and a low, mournful wail filled the room. The church door slammed open, and an icy wind swept through the space, extinguishing the candles. Shadows twisted and writhed in the darkness, forming a vague humanoid shape. The Strzyga. Its hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light as it glided toward the altar. The whispers turned to a deafening roar, echoing off the stone walls. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow loomed over me.
Remember me.
It rasped, its voice layered and echoing.
Remember my name.
Say it, Janek, the elder shouted over the cacophony. Speak its name. I stared at the journal, my mind racing. The name was scrawled at the bottom of the final page, jagged and bold. Summoning all of my courage, I shouted it into the darkness. Kazimir. The Strzyga let out a piercing scream, its form unraveling into tendrils of shadow that dissipated in the air. The whispers ceased, leaving only an oppressive silence behind. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The elder placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. You have shown it the truth, she said softly. Its anger has faded, but its memory will remain. The forest does not forget. I nodded weakly, too drained to respond. As I clutched the now empty journal, I knew while the Strzyga's wrath had been quelled, something deeper still lingered in the shadows of the forest. This was far from over. The silence that followed the Strzyga's disappearance didn't last long. Though the immediate danger had passed, the tension in the village remained palpable. People spoke in hushed tones, their glances constantly flicking toward the edge of the forest. Even as the sun rose higher, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I sat near the church on the same low stone wall where Merrick and I had talked the day before. The journal lay on my lap, its once weighty presence now strangely empty. But despite everything that happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The Strzyga might have been appeased for now, but the forest memory wasn't something that would fade so easily. You all right? Merrick asked, walking up beside me. He handed me a piece of bread, though I barely noticed. Not really, I admitted. I keep thinking it's not over. Merrick gave a nervous chuckle. You sound like my grandmother. She says the forest never forgets. I didn't respond. Instead, I ran my fingers over the worn leather of the journal, remembering the words etched into its pages. Betrayal, anger, an unwillingness to rest. By late afternoon, a meeting was called in the village square. The elders stood at the center, surrounded by worried faces. Everyone had gathered, farmers, hunters, even the children who clung to their parents' sides. I stayed near the back, Merrick at my side. The forest remains a threat, the elder began, her voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. Though the Strzyga's rage has been quelled, its spirit is not at peace. We must honor what it once was, but we must also be vigilant. The forest has marked one among us. Every head turned in my direction. My heart pounded as I felt their eyes on me, some filled with fear, others with curiosity. Janek, the elder continued, beckoning me forward. Reluctantly, I stepped through the crowd, feeling Merrick's reassuring hand on my shoulder as I passed him. You hold the journal, the key to its memory, she said when I reached her. The forest chose you. It will not forget, and neither can we. So, what do I do? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. How do I stop it for good? The elder's expression softened. You must return to the place where it began. Face the forest. Show it that you understand. Only then can its spirit find rest. Merrick stepped forward. You can't send him back in there alone, he said, his voice trembling. It's too dangerous. I have to, I said, surprising even myself with the steadiness in my voice. This started with me. I have to finish it. The crowd murmured again, this time with a mix of admiration and fear. Merrick opened his mouth to protest, but I shook my head. It'll be fine, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I'll be back before you know it. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the fields, I stood at the edge of the forest once more. The trees stretched before me, dark and foreboding, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to ensnare me. Are you sure about this? Merrick asked, standing a few paces behind me. His voice wavered, but his concern was genuine. No, I admitted, but I don't have a choice. With a final glance back at my friend, I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The sounds of the village fading behind me as I followed the familiar path deeper into the forest. My lantern cast a weak glow, barely illuminating the narrow trail ahead. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. It felt as though the forest itself was watching me, its unseen eyes peering through the twisted branches. I clutched the journal tightly, its presence both a comfort and a burden. When I reached the clearing where I had first found the shrine, I stopped. The air here felt different, heavier than before. The remnants of the shrine were still there, though they now seemed more decayed, as if they had aged centuries in a matter of days. Casimir, I whispered, the name feeling strange on my tongue. I know your story. I know what happened to you. A cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. The shadows around me seemed to deepen, twisting into shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. I'm sorry, I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. You were betrayed, forgotten, but it doesn't have to end like this. The wind grew stronger and the shadows coalesced into a single form. The Strzyga appeared before me, its hollow eyes burning with an otherworldly light. The air grew colder still, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar.
Remember,
it rasped, its voice echoing through the clearing.
Remember me.
Holding the journal high, I opened it to the first page. The ink glowed faintly in the dim light, the words seeming to come alive. I remember, I said, my voice firm. You were a soldier, a brother. You fought for your people. You were more than what they made you. The Strzyga paused, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers softened, turning into a mournful wail. You don't have to stay here, I continued. You can rest. You can be free. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final piercing cry, the Strzyga began to unravel. Its form dissolved into tendrils of shadow that faded into the night, leaving only a faint echo of its presence behind. The clearing grew silent, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. As I stood there, heart pounding, as the last of the shadows disappeared. It was over. I turned and made my way back toward the village, the journal still clutched tightly in my hand. The forest felt different now, less hostile. The whispers were gone, replaced by a serene stillness. When I emerged from the woods, Merrick was waiting for me, his face pale but relieved. "Did you do it?" he asked. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. As we walked back toward the village together, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The forest stood silent and still, but I knew its memory was long. And though the Strzyga was gone, its story would live on, in the journal, in the whispers, and in me.